position and how that hinge position happens as far as when it relates to pitching and what new cycles and new things, new information tells us as far as what happens and what goes on. So one of the biggest questions and one of the biggest things that lots of people are asking about or talking about is the change of rules that allows us to put the back foot further back in order to elicit, is it a performance increase? Are we going to allow pitchers to do this, do that? And if you watch some of my stories before, you know that my opinion on this and everything that I think about this is directly related to, well, you should be able to hinge from any position, period. From the position you were in the rubber before, you should have been able to access the hips, access the legs, and do all those things. So if you haven't seen the video I pushed about floor pressure application and those things, it's going to be very, very similar along the lines of how do we get into a hinge position and what are we doing as far as when the hinge happens and how that relates to what we're doing. So the first thing we have to really understand and when we're moving is that if I am hinging, regardless of where I put my foot back, if you want to say it's an advantage for you to be able to drop your foot back even further back here or anything like that, the first thing you have to understand is there's a very big difference from looking like or being in position to create movement. That doesn't always mean that you're going to create or elicit the movement that you prefer happen. And the reason that's important is because there's a lot of kids, there's a lot of athletes, there's a lot of pitchers that have this idea in their head that I want to look like someone else when I'm pitching. That there's pictures that I have to look like and assume that if you take a still shot and you look similar to that person, then that means you're okay. And that is completely wrong. The reason we decide and we talk about getting into positions is because we have to understand that movement happens because of mechanisms in place prior to the conclusion or result of that movement. And the easy way to understand that is that my stride leg. Does my stride leg, and first of all, my left foot, if I'm a right-handed pitcher, am I following my left foot? Is my hip following and being pulled by my left foot? Or is my left knee and foot being driven by my left hip? Those are two very different things that if you take a still shot, you can look at and think that the same thing is happening. I just had a recent analysis that I did of several groups of kids that were given a certain cue during their pitching. That cue made all of them look like they were developing a nice high stride, the knee was coming up, knee drive, all of that stuff. But there were a lot of things before that that would tell me that that shouldn't happen. And so if you want to think of, if you've ever heard like any speed and agility coach talk about get your knees up or anything like that, the first thing a kid or an athlete will do when they hear that cue is they will tilt their chin up and they will pull their knees up. And this is incorrect because if we understand laws of motion, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. And when it comes to applying force into the ground, my knee height is a direct result of the energy that I put into the ground prior to it coming up. So it is improper and incorrect for me to think of knee drive and knee height and think of pulling the knee up. If you're going to focus on pulling all the time, you're not going to focus on applying force into the ground. It's just not going to happen. No matter how slow you run, you're not going to be able to switch that effectively. Number one. Number two, most of you and most athletes and kids have no idea how to conceptualize the difference between am I attacking the ground or am I pulling my knee up? So they do one or the other. And that's just how they operate and how they work because they're very literal. And the same thing happened with these kids in their pitching motion. All of them would demo and demonstrate a high stride, but the posture they were in, the extension angle of the knee at that point, didn't give me information to say that they should be achieving that type of knee height, because all these other things before that weren't correct. And so what I'm talking about is when we have our stride leg and when we hinge, one of the biggest things that people have trouble with is, first of all, this straight back leg. And when I talk about having a stiff back leg, I need you to understand this. When I rock back and I lean from here, what the most likely signal you are telling this leg, that this hip is telling this brain, is that I'm already in extension right here. I'm already in hip extension. If your body is telling your brain you're already in hip extension, you're not going, that you finished hip extension, you're not going to access any of the neural drive that's going to create and drive this knee through. It's just like dorsiflexing the foot and coming through. And a lot of kids pull up instead of push through. Now understand that because that was happening for these kids, we would get still images and still shots of their knee being right here all the time. But the posture and how their stack looked didn't provide the information necessary for it to mean that they could access that position. And then I was told the cues that they're given to pitch. One of the first cues they're given is to adduct their scapula. So, when you go into scapular adduction, that means you're pinching your back, you're doing this. Your traps are a primary mover within that motion. So, for most kids, we have forward head posture. For most adults, for most everything, because we carry our phones below eye level, because we read, because we sit, we work at a desk, our head is usually slightly in front. For some kids, it's even worse. Like I said last night, if you go look in the mirror and you're a pitcher, you're going to have one shoulder higher than the other. If you're an overhead athlete, you're going to have one shoulder higher than the other. If you work at a desk and primarily use your right hand to lay on the mouse and the left hand is free, you're going to have one shoulder higher than the other. It's just what the environment creates for you, and so there's excess tightness. That tightness comes from the upper traps and the lats. There's a force couple there. Those two muscles are tight, along with the chest as well. Right here, your pectoralis major and minor. So, if I'm pitching and I get a cue that before I move, I'm going to adduct my scapula, I'm going to signal the muscles that do that. So that is your traps. If your middle and lower trap don't work very well, don't activate, because most of your motion through your scapula is through your upper traps, when you adduct like this, you're going to also signal and create a need for your cervical spine and neck to go into extension as well. And I talked about earlier, when kids are told in speed and agility training to pick their knees up, they are literal. So the first thing they do is chin up and pull. And it makes it look like the knee is getting high. And so you could pass a test if you took a picture at that moment and be like, that kid's got great knee drive. That kid's got knee drive. And the same thing was happening within the pitching motion. The same thing was happening to that point. Because the cue for the athlete was to bring their knee up instead of out, as far as driving that stride leg, not out and up, not out, but just up, in combination and conjunction with a pre-existing dysfunction of forward head posture, tight upper traps, tight chest, inactive serratus, which is actually the most probably important muscle you're not thinking about or not using or working on or doing anything with in your pitching or overhand movements or any scapular humeral rhythm movement if if that is prior existing in your body, when you pull that knee up in your head and you're thinking up and you're straight up, you're going to create an image, if you take a still shot, that you are in a position that most people who study and look at what other great pitchers do is acceptable. But we're going to have other things that tell us that why are these other things happening? Why is there pain? Why is there inflammation? Why aren't they throwing very well? It just doesn't look like they're using their legs, all this other stuff. Now, if I'm looking at it and I didn't understand the cues they were given, which I didn't at first, I was confused as to how are we looking and getting such neural drive of the hip if they're still starting in this manner. And back to the importance of understanding, when you start, I don't care how far you lean forward, you are completely telling this back leg and hip that it is not going to be necessary to be used to propel you forward. And you're just going to be a single leg driver. And understand this, if you create a pattern of how you create energy and move this hip through and absorb energy through this hip is by throwing the leg out, more than likely you're also going to land in your front side resistance in that manner. Meaning a lot of you will still land stiff and you will go into hyperextension of the knee because that's the same way you started. That's the same thing your brain is processing as an acceptable pattern of absorbing, creating, and moving forward. That's going to happen over and over and over again. And so it's super important. It's super important when we're discussing dysfunction. So what does a child or an athlete have prior to the motion? As a human mover in space, what don't they have access to? Those same things are not going to be accessible when it comes to any other skill motion. Pitching becomes a skill motion at the point where we actually pitch and throw the ball, just about like right here. That becomes something that's slightly different than normal human movement. But largely in effect, pitching is a normal human motion. It is a normal human motion. And the more we try to take away the human side of it, of how someone walks and runs naturally, or not care about how they walk and run naturally, the more we're going to get away from being able to improve that motion. And the reason for that is very simple. If we have certain force vectors that we work in, meaning a force vector generally tells you the general direction of where energy you're creating is going to go. So, for example, like if you're looking at shin angles and you're looking at the angle of your shin and then the angle of the ground, the force vector cuts that in half. So you're going to create diagonal energy. If you're looking at the force vector between your torso and your femur, if you're in a proper hinge, that means cutting in half that the energy is going to hit horizontally. And so the whole purpose of understanding how the foot turns the knee, turns the hip, is important because your body moves from knee hinge right here, knee dominant motion and muscle, to as I create that muscle and I create that diagonal energy, I have to have something that's going to push it forward. And there's a very easy understanding of that. If you stand just straight right here and all you do is bend your knees up and down, you're never going to move forward. Never in your life will you move forward, just unhinging and hinging. But if you squeeze your butt from this standing position as hard as you can, it's going to propel you forward. That's how propulsion works. You sequence and go from ankle, knee, to hip. And if you're not doing that in the motions that you want to be explosive in, you're not going to have the access to everything else that you're doing training-wise. Doesn't matter how much you squat, how much you kettlebell swing, how much you hip thrust, how much you do any of that stuff, because your strength is only learned in that position. It is not a mechanism that is used within your pitching motion. And that is problematic when we get to plateauing and we get to all of those other things. So it's important that we understand that. that we really, really understand this basic concept. It is not what I look like. It is what creates what I look like that is important, and how that creation happens. That is so important to understand. And last night when I was doing those analysis, it was a perfect example for me of when I don't understand what the goal and objective is of that PC or what they're queuing. If I don't get all that information first, I sometimes can even be, I wasn't necessarily tricked, but it was confusing to me as to why that was still successfully happening, but nothing that happened before that would show that we should get to that position. And that's how we can fool ourselves into thinking that we're doing things right because, oh, step 3 looked good. But step 1 was still really bad. How did step 3 look good? Well, because of the same thing. What are you cueing and what are you having the athlete understand to do? Because they're literal. It's the same thing if an athlete doesn't finish knee to knee or close correctly. A lot of them, they know they didn't finish knee to knee, or they know they didn't close correctly. So they'll just kind of do an extra after everything is gone in the hopes that, oh, well, maybe they didn't see. And that's just how humans work. That's just how we work as humans all the time. So being able to understand movement from the aspect that's not related to pitching is important. It's very important. And one of the benefits for me as an individual and as someone who is in this space now and come into this space is that my understanding of human movement came first from basic gait, sprints, agility, change of direction. And so when you send me something, or when I see an athlete pitch, throw, hit, do any of those things, I am completely unbiased about looking at who they are. I just see them as a mover in space, and do they move well with the tasks and objectives they're given. A lot of people who are raised in the cycle and community of pitching all the time have this sort of regurgitation of information, and as you grow in knowledge, you're trying to tie what you're learning in biomechanics, what you're learning in human movement, you're trying to find a way to fit that into the pitching motion, when it should be the other way around. If this is how someone naturally is able to propel themselves forward, if this is how we walk, if this is how energy is created with everything else in life, okay, how do I make the pitching motion simulate that as best as possible? And that's how I should be thinking. That's how I should be working. So, as we move forward, in correlation to, and in conjunction to getting to our hinge, okay, the reason a hinge load is highly successful and will prevent and allow us to do a lot of things is because we have to understand that tension is not our enemy. And when I use the word tension, I'm talking about tensegrity. Tensegrity is a principle that our muscles and our bones and all those things are held in place by our fascial network. So you want to think of a web and your bones being like dowels that are held and moved in place according to the tension in different spots of your body. It's the reason that when we do things or when we have pain and inflammation, that you can touch something on someone's neck that will affect their feet and vice versa, because there are certain chains and networks upstream, downstream, and everywhere throughout the body that work congruently together to allow us to move as movers in space. And that tension is always there. So I try not to use the word stretch so much. I'd rather use the word lengthen and retension or tension actively, because what's always happening is as something tenses more on our anterior side or our front side or our back side, something on my back side has to allow that tension to happen. You're never going to get any longer. It's just something compresses as the other thing, expands. And so we have to understand that. So when we're talking, and I'm talking about tension, understand that that's what I mean by that word. So if I'm saying tense your body up or something like that, or more in a pitching cycle, you say, well, I don't want to be tense. I was like, actually, yes, you do want to be tense. You just haven't really talked about tensegrity or or fascia in a way that allows you to understand how tension works throughout the body. And there's several examples of this. One of them is, well, I don't want to have tension in, my upper body. I want it to be loose, whippy, those types of things. And to a point, that's true. What you want to have is mobility, the mobility that already pre-exists. So say my shoulder, for example, is a ball and socket joint. What I have to understand, and what most kids will do, is because of the stress and tension related in their upper traps, anytime you tell them to tense up, they will shrug their shoulders. So for me as a coach, now I automatically think that I don't want you to be tense. So now a kid, once again, is literal and will take that as, oh, I relax everything. And then you tell them, well, no, I want this tense. And they don't know how to put two and two together. And that's an issue. That's a problem. It becomes problematic. And we see those happen within our movement. When we curve out, when we do all those things, and all those other things happen. So we have to understand how tension leverages itself in the right place. So if I'm talking about the shoulder specifically, if you cannot provide tension through your lower body and up to right before the shoulder in that area, the more tension and stability, because tension creates stability, understand that, the more stability I have through this area all the way down, the more I'm going to have access to the ball and socket joints, ranges of motion. So the better my circle is going to be, the better range of movement I'm going to have. All those things are going to be predicated and have lying responsibilities towards how your lower half is tensioned. And you cannot ignore one side of it. If I have no tension in my stride leg in the beginning and in the end as it's moving, that's going to affect the opposite side. Number one, because that's the sling that's being worked from the right shoulder and arm line all the way to the contralateral glute, inside the adductor, all those things. And then if we get deeper in the spiral line, all the way into your plantar aponeurosis and your three arches and all those things. So all these things are complex, but we can simplify those things by understanding, okay, tension, floor pressure, hinge, and engagement. Okay? So if you've seen my videos on floor pressure, when we're talking about hinge, when we're talking about those things, understand I don't care where you put your leg back. Every athlete is going to have a different space that they're going to put their leg back in. The new rule allows them to find and explore that range of motion. And all your athletes will have slightly different explosive ranges of motion. And when I use the word explosive range of motion, what I'm talking about is the range of motion for their structure to be able to apply and redirect as much force and energy as possible. Just because one kid works really well at a shin angle of 45 degrees doesn't mean another kid is going to be the exact same. You have to understand that. Different structures, different bone lengths, all those things. So, if we're in this position, we have to understand that this is just a hinge of the knee. This is just a hinge of the knee. And so once again, I'll talk a lot about this position because it's something that's regurgitated a lot. It's a lot of information on. Now I can get deeper into my lean and I can get deeper into the hinge of this knee. The problem, like I said with that, is not just the signaling from the back leg. When we start to move to what the front leg does in this spot, a lot of times for a lot of the kids that pre-move and have their pre-motion before they actually load into the ground, a big reason for that is because of the lack of tension back here. If I don't have any tension from this position, my brain understands that I want to explode forward. But without tension, creating the stability in my body, as soon as I go to drive on this leg, as soon as that moment happens for me, my brain is going to autocorrect itself and try to find a position where I can access the explosiveness that my brain is being tasked to do towards the catcher. So that is why we'll see a lot of this happen. You'll see a lot of that pre-motion turning. Your foot pronating is perfectly acceptable if it's happening at your load moment, meaning if it's happening at the moment that your foot and your brain and body deliver application of force into the ground to be able to come out of it. If it happens any time before that, during your style or whatever you're doing prior to your load moment. You cannot categorize load moment as anything else but the signaling of the brain to the body at the moment you decide to load into the ground. Anything else is not loading. It's just not. You can't categorize it that way. It's just not going to be, it's not going to happen very well. Okay? So, a lot of that, like I said, is because if we're not stable and tensioned, your brain is like, well, I know what I want to do, but I'm not in the best position to do it. So my foot is going to move, and my knee is going to externally rotate to find a position to be able to do that in. Okay? And we counter that with a lot of times when kids get told, we rock back to put weight on the back leg. A lot of kids understand your leg and hip is two different things, number one. So when we rock back, a lot of kids lean out. So we rock, and then this happens. Now, that would be okay if 100% of kids got back to a position that they would be able to explode from without moving their foot. But they don't, and that's why the foot turns. When we have excessive movement to load, when you do this, you are not loading the leg and tensioning the leg, you're moving towards your glute medius. So one turns on more and the other becomes inactive. So if it's inactive, if it's not working, and for most athletes, they don't have very strong glute mediuses, so it's not going to be pushed back anyway. So when that happens, if we don't get back to this, which most athletes won't do, they will search to just fall into that. They will fall into turning that foot because of tension, because of the lack of tension, because of tension equals stability, and the lack of stability creates autocorrection within our brain to find a spot where we're stable, and that's why the foot moves. If we hinge successfully, what we'd like to have, okay, is a hinge from not just your knee, but your hips, okay? And so the way we do that, the way we access that from this position is I have to apply floor pressure first. Big toe, great toe, fifth metatarsal, activate the transverse arch, those things. That activates longitudinal, medial, blah, blah, blah. Activate your foot pressure into the ground. So when I do that, I'm still upright, I'm still stacked. Now, if I want to hinge at the hips, okay, a lot of kids don't know how to do that without going back, or you'll lose this back leg. You don't have to lose the back leg, and that's why I'm such a proponent for stagger stance kettlebell swings. I teach them, and I want you to understand them because they help the back leg understand what it should be doing to provide energy to both hips. So when I'm in this position, the first thing I'm going to do, I want to be sure the core is locked, so ribs pulled down, braced. I want to be sure that this front foot, I have to apply tension in this front foot, and that tension has to be directed backwards to activate this hamstring. If you don't activate this hamstring, you're going to lose stability in this knee, which is going to cause you having to put this back leg down. So, when tension is applied, all I have to do is hinge right here. That's all I have to do. I don't have to necessarily go any deeper than this. And if you look at it, there's a lot of similarity into that torso height in what everyone else is doing. But understand that for a lot of people, the upright position they get to is not moved because of your hips, and it has to be. It is moved either because your knee is unhinging or because you don't know how to do it, and so your cue from your brain to your mind is just to push your shoulders back. And that happens in a lot of single leg drivers that end up like this because they're here and they come up with their torso by pushing their chest back, and their knee helps provide that upright posture. Your hips should be providing that upright posture, because the same thing if you're doing, just think about the position you're in. If you're doing a hip thrust from a bench, when you finish your hip thrust, what are you? You're stacked. If I stood you up in that position, you would just be here, but just straight. Because your hips, when they get into extension and your core is tight, your spine comes to neutral. But if your hips aren't moving your torso, you're going to create the image of upright posture without any stability in that posture. Meaning, a lot of times you're going to actually tense your shoulder up, because if tension isn't provided from here down, it's going to find it somewhere else. If you just understand that rule, if you don't have access to a range of motion where it should happen, like your shoulder, your brain goes to the next joint to try to find it. And this is similar and common in all types of work, all types of throwing motions, all types of movement, period. So we've got to understand those concepts. We've got to be able to clarify those things. So when I hinge, you can have different types of hinges. Some kids will need to go lower. I have some kids, like, that's just your style. It doesn't matter to me what the style is. What matters to me is, can you still apply tension, and can you make sure that the signaling from the quad, hamstring gets to the glutes so that you get upright because of your hips. And that matters, and that's important. All these sequences have to happen correctly, because if they're not, we are going to sacrifice something else to look like what someone is asking us to look like. And that can be excess tibial torsion, that can be excess knee rotation, that can be improper front side absorption, and so now we have low back pain, now we have this. That can be my arm being too flaccid and not being able to internally rotate when I switch my lats on and I'm able to do those things. And so that's always important. And all of that has to do and is caused and relatable to what you do at the beginning. You will never in your life, be able to fix step 10 without step 1. You can get into step 10's position and make it look good, but then when you try all of it all over again, if step 1 is trash, everything after that is going to be trash, period. And if you're not getting your tension and stability from floor pressure, from hinging, okay, that's a hinge. That's as far as I've got to go. If you want to go further back, that's fine, but understand that I'm still hinged. And when I start to create that moment, everything moves to create a double shin angle. Number 1, I want to get my back and this angle matching, and that's going to transfer over to this shin and my back matching. Here, and I'm through. I don't want to hit that, the shelves in front of me, but that is generally how a hinge should work and a hinge should happen. And the way that works is through floor pressure. So that floor pressure application video that some of you guys received who said yes to wanting the link, it is exactly how you mold it and modify it. And like I said, if someone needs to step slightly further back, that's okay. What I'm looking for as a coach is can I create floor pressure from this back leg? Can I access? Can you feel this hamstring turn on? Driving this foot forward. Because what happens initially during this motion is you get a pull from the front leg. This pull from the front leg is supposed to match up with the push from the back leg. The reason that works is because at a certain point, if you're doing this slowly and you're just coming forward, you're going to feel a point where if you're pinching the ground, front leg activating the hamstring, you're going to feel your hamstring slightly switch off and your quads start to turn on more. That's the signal to your brain that you're starting to get to the knee dominant portion of the movement. Because you have a good angle, you can push now, and your hips, because you did it the right way, are already signaled to co-contract with that motion. And that's super, super, super important as we work through knee and hip dominant movement. So when you're thinking about how do I create better hinges? How do I find better hinges? One of the easiest things you can test for biorhythm, you can have 2 things. How many of your kids can be here, knees slightly bent? Swing. Swing. Get into supination as the hand moves forward. This looks super easy and I look super rhythmic. Try it and see how difficult it actually is for you to find this rhythm so quickly. That's it. And a lot of kids can't find that rhythm. They can't, because they don't know how to hinge and unhinge. They don't know how to do any of that. You'll find kids who do this and push their knees out because you're so quad and knee dominant when it comes to thinking, oh, I've got to create energy in a horizontal manner. The other thing we can do, like I said, staggered stance kettlebell swings. Staggered stance kettlebell swings show us, if you've watched my video on YouTube and seen the breakdown, I really get to see how that back leg works. And it's that simple. Can kids find that rhythm? Can you never feel any weight in your arm when you're doing that thrust? That's important, because you shouldn't. Because everything else is supplying the tension to make that feel weightless and to allow range of movement where? Through the shoulder, because everything else is tense. Applicable mechanism tied to skill movement. Mechanism is more important than the skill moment as far as training. Just because something looks like hitting, pitching, throwing, all those things, doesn't mean it helps or translates to that actual skill, because it's the mechanism that's important. And one of the reasons, another additional reason why understanding how to hinge and do those things is important is because your athletes are going to spend so much time in a weight room doing something that strengthens a hinge movement, that strengthens knee dominant movement, that strengthens hip dominant movement. And then if you pitch in a motion that doesn't use any of that, how are you expecting the application and addition of strength, hypertrophy, power, explosiveness, any of those things that they've been training to transfer to a motion that is completely dissimilar than what they're training? It's going to be very difficult, and it's going to be very hard, and you're going to require an athlete that is super, super in tune with how their body works and how their body comes into propulsion, locomotion, and motion. I didn't really see any questions because I was too far away.